Good morning and welcome to the second NSoJ political union debate. And today's topic is to do with Article 370 and Kashmir, and whether the social contract that India had with the people of Kashmir has been disturbed in any way in the last week, the actions of the central government. We're joined for this discussion by Malavika Prasad, who's a constitutional law scholar and newspaper columnist. Welcome, Malavika. We will have this discussion in three segments. The first segment will talk about the legality of the loss of the special status for Jammu and Kashmir. The second segment will deal with the reorganization of the state, and the third will deal with the lockdown in communications. So to introduce the first segment, I'm going to call Anuj Raithe to come down and introduce the subject.
July 5th, 2019. 10 days before the 72nd Independence Day of the world's largest democracy, the Indian government passed one of the most controversial bills in the democratic history or the parliamentarian history of India. The Article 370 was scrapped. Many call it the political equivalent to demonetization, while for the rest, it is just yet another masterstroke from the Modi government. This act will have a far-reaching repercussions for the rest type state, as the abrogation suspends the clause under which the laws to be made for the state had first to be ratified by the state legislature, which currently happens to be dissolved. India's President Ramnath Kovind used his presidential powers under Clause 1 of Article 370 and did away with Article 35A, which defined the concept of permanent residentship and the privileges which were enjoyed by the people of Kashmir for 70 long years. At midnight, 4th of July, the big political powerhouses at Kashmir were put under house arrest, the communication was barred, and curfew was officially imposed. The next day, the cabinet meets, and as the day of 5th of July, that is Monday, ends, the Kashmir issue just, it took a spark, and Kashmir's 370 Act was dissolved. Was this all undemocratic? What impact will this have on the Kashmir in the years to come? Will this help the state flourish, or will only degrade the value of the state? How will Pakistan's proactive approach hurt India's interest? Is this just a fine example of unity and secularism or political inclusiveness, or is this just another forced unity by India's Prime Minister? Article 370 and this whatever debate which is going around it is only centered towards Kashmir, but we also need to know that when Article 370 will be recounted in the future, it will not only rewrite the history for the state of Jammu and Kashmir, but will also do the same for the state of, or for the region of Ladakh, which had been asking for the for the UT status for 70 long years. The Kashmir issue, of course, had sparked a lot, and as the India's first Prime Minister said that at the stroke of midnight hour, India will awaken when the world sleeps. Will this happen 72 years down the line? Same for Kashmir. One needs to wait and needs to learn. Because as we know that Kashmir has performed better than 13 rest Indian states on different parameters. So it also questions the importance and the relevance of the scrapping of Article 370. Was it done too early? Was it done in a hurry? Or did it take too long to happen in 2019? Thank you.
Thank you, Anuj. So the question really for you, and thank you for that, that wonderful exposition. For you, Malavika, is if you can just take us through the historical social contract that India had with Jammu and Kashmir, and whether or not, leaving aside the political consequences, whether or not this is strictly legal, constitutional. As a constitutional law expert, if you could explain to the audience, I will be very grateful. You can stand and speak, perhaps, because we've got the...
Oh, that's the... All right. So 370 is considered to have given Kashmir special status, but there is something larger to be understood about the Indian federal context before we jump into the special question of Kashmir. And that larger special context is this. India is a union of states that is very unlike the United States as a union of states. The United States has many sovereign units coming together, surrendering some parts of their sovereignty to the center, so that the center can take care of these several sovereign units in a loose fashion. India, on the other hand, is not several sovereign units coming together. It's several territorially contiguous but ethnically, geopolitically, and linguistically disparate units coming together. So political theorists call this a holding together federation, as opposed to the American model, which is a coming together federation. Why is this detour important to understand? Because every single state is special in the center's eyes between Articles 370 and 371J. Even Karnataka has special status in one of the later 371 articles. And it's just a matter of understanding how different each of our special statuses are. So the Kashmir special status historically is that the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir accedes to the Indian Union by an instrument of accession that is a little unlike the remaining princely states acceding to the Indian Union. Why was it unlike the other princely states? Partly because of the position, partly geographical position, partly because of the composition of being a Muslim majority in the Kashmir Valley, and partly because the Raja who ruled Kashmir at the time was representing a different interest. But this history has assumed lesser significance after we have written in Article 370 into the Constitution. Why do I say that? Because Article 370 has incorporated the terms of the instrument of accession into the Constitution of India. So the moment we say that the instrument of accession is now binding on us in the constitutional text, then India, the government of India is bound by virtue of the constitutional text and not by virtue of the instrument of accession. Just like we're bound by virtue of the constitutional text to do everything else that the government of India does. So the pre-independence history is slightly outside of the legal context. Now let's talk about what's happening under 370. Under 370, India can only apply provisions of the Indian Constitution to the state of Jammu and Kashmir with the concurrence of the legislature of Jammu and Kashmir. This is an important thing to note. It's the concurrence as opposed to consultation. And what happens when you have to consult a state legislature? You have to consult an elected representative, a body of elected representatives, as opposed to the governor, who is not an elected official under the Indian constitutional framework. What has happened instead in the 5th August, 6th August period is that the president has extended all provisions of the Indian constitution to the state of Jammu and Kashmir, while Jammu and Kashmir was under president's rule. Ostensibly, they have done this with the governor's consent, but when there is no elected government in place, then you cannot possibly extend all provisions of the Indian Constitution into the state of Jammu and Kashmir because you haven't consulted the elected representatives. There's also a legal nuance here, which is that Article 370 says that by virtue of the text of Article 370 itself, 370 will always apply in the same terms to India and to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. But what the presidential order has attempted to do is to apply all the provisions of the Indian Constitution to the state of Jammu and Kashmir in an unmodified form. And the only provision which shall be modified per this order is Article 370, which is forbidden by the text of Article 370. So what happens when 370 embodies the compact between the Indian Union and the people of Jammu and Kashmir? Let's say that the president decides to modify it. He can theoretically just modify it for the state of Jammu and Kashmir because that's all 370 permits him to do, to apply the Indian Constitution differently to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And then the state of India is bound by 370 as it stands in our law books. But we have assumed that the modification of 370 to the state of Jammu and Kashmir also applies to us, and therefore suddenly now the governor can consent instead of the elected representatives. So this is it's been a clever legal maneuver, but I think there is a strong case to be made against it under the Constitution's text. Is that?
Yeah, we
we probably have a minute or two in your allocated time for this segment. So, can you, for example, explain to the audience what impact this action has, if it is upheld, in terms of setting a precedent for the rest of the country, in tangible ways?
Sure. I think, of course, the most tangible precedent, and I hate to make this a legal debate because there is a massive human conflict underlying it that we wish away from existence by talking about the legal question. I think in that sense, the precedent will be incomparable, the kind of unilateral imposition of the Constitution that's taking place. But in another sense, I think it'll stand for two legal precedents. One is that now, under President's rule, elected governments anywhere can be displaced because the governor will be answerable to the President under President's rule. This is a constitutional nuance again, because Article 356, which is the provision on imposing President's rule in a state, says that the President can intervene in a state in order to carry out government in accordance with provisions of this Constitution, which is to say that if I am the President, I can only impose President's rule to uphold the Constitution, not to change the Constitution radically. So I think that is a standout precedent. What can the President do? If this is upheld, the President can do the same thing to all other states in the country. But on the 370 question, do you want me to continue? Okay. On the 370 question, what does this stand as a precedent for? It stands as a precedent for having a non-elected body speak for the people of the country. Again, Kashmir has been under communication blockade, so there was no significant way in which, on the 5th of August, representatives from Kashmir could issue press statements about what was going on. The people of Kashmir probably do not even have a full picture of the media narrative in the state of India by virtue of the communication lockdown. So there is that one democratic loss, so to speak. But the second democratic loss is that there is no body of elected representatives. And if 370 is to be revoked under Article 370, subclause 3, we were required to consult the Constituent Assembly of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And the Constituent Assembly of the state of Jammu and Kashmir is a body that was dissolved in 1955, no doubt. But what is a Constituent Assembly? It is a body that constitutes a state, or in the alternative, once the state is constituted and a constitution exists, it is the body that amends the constitution. So even if the Constituent Assembly is dissolved, the only permissible way under Article 370 subclause 3 is to consult any other body with constituent power, and that body would potentially be the elected representatives of Jammu and Kashmir, assuming constituent power, and taking a decision that they want to now be a regular state in the eyes of the Indian Union. But that has not happened because while under President's rule, there is no elected body of representatives. So on the one hand, there is already the illegality that we cannot have all the provisions of the Constitution of India apply to them without consulting elected representatives. And on the other hand, we have a deeper illegality, which is that at the end of 6th August, we have revoked 370 through Article 370 subclause 3. And for doing that, we need to consult with a body that has constituent amending power, not even just legislative power. And to do that by consulting the governor there has been no constitutional precedent that will permit that. So to uphold this would mean we're surrendering parliamentary government. It means we're becoming a presidential style of.
Okay, so because they are students of journalism and not students of law, I will try to take a minute to sort of break it down in layman's terms. What Malavika has very eloquently stated is that to be able to amend the level of influence or the impact of various provisions of the Indian Constitution in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, you would need to have the buy-in from the local legislative body, okay, which would be the assembly which doesn't exist right now. That's the first level. The second level is to abrogate 370. There is one argument to say you can't ever do it because the Constituent Assembly was dissolved in 1954. So whatever they wanted to bake in was baked in, and that's permanent. That's one argument. Even if you leave that aside and say that, you know what, you can read into the fact that the Legislative Assembly, the local government in Jammu and Kashmir can actually amend the Jammu and Kashmir constitution, and therefore that assumes the power of the Constituent Assembly. You can't abrogate without getting a resolution from that body. Okay, so if you literally read the text, you know, it's permanent. You can never change it. But if you sort of read it purposively in a way that's a more, you know, a living document, then at a minimum you would need to have the local assembly to pass a resolution, and on the recommendation of which the president, you know, says, you know, the people of Kashmir have said enough. We're fully integrated into the state of India, and we resolve to do away with any special rights and privileges we have. Then they make a recommendation. That's a recommendation. So Article 373 is a recommendation. So the state needs to recommend to the president's representative, I guess the governor, and then the president on the recommendation of the people. That's what democracy is about. On the recommendation of the people of Kashmir, the president says 370 no longer exists. Now the challenge we have is we don't, Kashmir has been under president's rule for more than a year. So there is no local government. Okay, so does that make sense, the legality, you know, where we are right now? Okay, so now we're moving to the, I'm sure you all will have questions, and Malavika will be happy to answer those questions after, but just to sort of clarify for you what Malavika was saying. So the next segment is on the reorganization of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. I'm going to invite Anika Gomez, a first-year student, to lay down the premise for that.
Following the Prime Minister's announcement about the bifurcation of Jammu and Kashmir, we have seen a lot of opinions and rage from all across the country. But before we get into the details, let me first break down the difference between a state and a union territory. So a state is a division under the Indian constituency which has its own government. So the elected government has the right to make its own laws and also has a legislative administration. A union territory, on the other hand, comes under the rule of the central government. So they have a lieutenant governor who acts as a representative of the president. Union territories are not represented in the Rajya Sabha. This is an exception in the cases of Delhi and Puducherry. So coming back to the subject at hand, President Ramnath Kovind gave assent to the bifurcation of Jammu and Kashmir into two union territories, which is Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. So after this, the Prime Minister had addressed in his television address on Thursday, which is the 8th of August, stating that Jammu and Kashmir will be holding the status of a union territory, but it will be temporary. But on the other hand, Ladakh will permanently have the status of a union territory. So currently the situation is that Jammu and Kashmir will hold the status of a union territory temporarily, because according to the government, the situation has to normalize and come under their control. So until then, Jammu and Kashmir will be considered as a union territory. Currently, while all the chaos and everything around us has been occurring, there is a humanistic aspect to this, but the government now is focusing on bringing the situation under control. And while Ladakh is going to be considered as a union territory permanently, there is still a chance that Jammu and Kashmir will be given the status of being a state under India. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anika. So I think, you know, we probably need to go back again to the process. What if you can just explain to the audience here and viewers outside on social media, what the process needs to be to actually change the status of a state from a state to a union territory, as well as to bifurcate? What is the legal constitutional process to do that, and what the criteria needs to be followed to, what the criteria needs to be to make sure that the process is followed, and if that was followed in the case of Jammu and Kashmir?
So the legal criteria are slightly different in the case of regular states outside of 370 and in the case of 370. Why do I say this? So Article 370 permitted the Indian government to apply provisions of the Indian Constitution, but with modifications to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Now, under that power, in a series of about 45 constitution application orders, almost the entire Constitution of India already applies to the state of Jammu and Kashmir, but in modified form. One of the provisions, therefore, that has been applied to the state of Jammu and Kashmir is the provision on state formation. But while regular states bound by the Constitution of India can only express their views on state reorganization, which is to say their views will not bind the union, the state of Jammu and Kashmir, under the Indian Constitution as applied to them, must be consenting to reorganization. And consent is a different thing than mere consultation under the Indian Constitution. So if a state is merely consulted, it means that they can say, I do not want to be reorganized, but the union can say, too bad, we think there is a good national imperative to reorganize you anyway. While with the state of Kashmir, given that we have this special history that is located in Article 370, only if the state of Jammu and Kashmir were to consent, which is to affirmatively say yes through its elected representatives, could the state be reorganized. But again, there has been terribly clever constitutional maneuvering to come out of this legal position, and that is this. Pardon me for the legalese, but we have to go back into Article 370, which permitted the president to impose provisions of the Indian Constitution in Kashmir. So what did he do on 5th August morning? He says every single provision of the Indian Constitution will now apply to the state of Jammu and Kashmir in unmodified format, except 370, which will now read governor can consent instead of the Sadar Riyasat, and the elected representatives can consent instead of the Constituent Assembly. So the only thing he's modified under the 5th August order is Article 370. Everything else now applies in Jammu and Kashmir in the same way it applies in India. So having done that, the special provision for consent in Jammu and Kashmir under the earlier constitution application orders has been wiped out as of 5th August morning. So between 5th August morning and 6th August evening is when all the action unfolds, right? So 5th August morning, the Constitution applies differently to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So the older requirement that they must consent rather than just merely be consulted has been effaced. And now the government of India runs on the assumption that Article 3 as it applies to the rest, Article 3 is the provision on reorganization of states. Now the government of India on 5th August morning runs on the presumption that Article 3 as it applies to the rest of the Union of India will apply to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Therefore, they need not be consenting to their reorganization, and therefore they can be divided up into union territories. What happens after the state reorganization bill is introduced is that the potential for the state of Jammu and Kashmir to say, we were actually required to consent to this proposal is eliminated, because on 6th August evening, the president introduces an Article 370 Clause 3 order, which says now 370 doesn't apply to Kashmir and us either. So between 5th August morning, 6th August evening, the Constitution reads in many different ways to make all of these things happen in real time. And suddenly now, as of 10th August morning, the Constitution doesn't read in that way anymore because they don't need it to read in that way anymore. So what happens with state reorganization now? The state has been divided into 3 union territories, and there is a good legal argument to say that is impermissible. For the reason that, as Anika mentioned, states have legislative powers, which is to say that elected representatives of the states, who are answerable to the people who voted them in, can enact laws on several different areas. But when a state becomes a union territory, their legislative powers are subject to a complete parliamentary override. So whatever powers they may have under the state list of the Indian Constitution, if the parliament feels it is in the interest of the state to override it, the union parliament may override it. This is historically unprecedented. The closest comparator is the state of Delhi, which was a Part C state as of its as of the Indian Constitution coming into being. And as a Part C state, it had legislative powers. What happened after the Indian Constitution came into being was that the 7th Amendment was enacted in the late 1950s that said all the Part C states will now be union territories. And so they were disenfranchised from the state powers they held into union territories, which meant they have parliamentary override. But why do I say this is the closest comparator and not a real precedent? All of these states that were demoted from states to union territories were demoted by way of constitutional amendment under Article 239 and 239A. And the state of Jammu and Kashmir has been demoted to union territories by way of a law, a regular law. What's the difference between the two? A constitutional amendment is modifying the text of the Constitution, which means that we have ascribed the new state of Delhi, or the new union territory of Delhi, constitutional status. That's a harder status to amend, unlike with the situation of creating a union territory by law. You just need a brute parliamentary majority to amend a law. You don't need a constitutional amendment to amend a law. And that's why this is a complicated and unprecedented situation that's hard to analyze in the law.
Okay, I think that was very, very helpful. Again, just to break it down, so you have, is it 2 thresholds or 3 thresholds? One is the view. It's just the view take the views of the state, right?
Yes.
Is that the first? And that's for Karnataka, for example. Is that the threshold? So if you belong to the state of Karnataka and the central government, decides for whatever reason to bifurcate or to change your status, they will seek the views of the elected body in Karnataka. But in Kashmir, they had a different threshold, which was consent, which means, again, it's pretty much like the recommendation, right? I guess a step lower than recommendation, where they need to go, the central government would need to go to the people of Jammu and Kashmir and get their legislative assembly to pass a resolution which says that we consent, we agree to our territory being divided or our status being changed. Is that right? Yeah. Okay.
And recommendation is a step higher in that they have to proffer the recommendation.
Sure. So recommendation for 370 is to abrogate it, is to recommend. Yeah. So the first step needs to come from, do you see that? The first step needs to come from, to recommend, the first step needs to come from the state itself. And for consent, it comes from the center, but then they need to agree to it, right? So is it clear? Is it sort of clear on this issue? The third issue, and you touched upon it, was the communications lockdown. And I think whether it's consent, whether it's recommendation, I think all of these are shorthand for the will of the people, because people elect their representatives to represent them. Right? So you can't say I'm not represented when you have a government in place, because you have elected the government and the government represents you. But in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, you don't have a government. And also the people's voices have been sort of curtailed. We have in our student body, we have a Kashmiri student, Muskan, who's here. And she's just going to explain to you the challenges she has had in terms of just getting in touch with her family. I mean, she lives far away from. So if you can, Muskan, if you can just come down. And I know that this is sort of a difficult situation for you, because it's the first time for you away from home and you're in the hostel. So for the benefit of all of us and to people who may be watching us, if you can just explain to us how often you used to speak to your parents before, and what has been the situation in the last week or so.
Hello everyone. So as far as Article 370 is concerned, I think that we have had many deep insights with regards to the matter. So as far as I am concerned, I have been away from my home, and many other students like me are away from their homes right now, pursuing their studies over here. So the thing that came about with this Article 370 was that our patience is being tried. Like we have, I last spoke to my parents on Sunday evening, and this is the 5th day that I have not spoken to them. I haven't heard from them. I don't know what is going on with them there, like how they are doing there. So I know nothing. Somehow yesterday my father tried contacting me, but he couldn't directly contact me. He contacted Dean ma'am. Having gone to the police station, he had to go to the police station, and then therein he could contact Dean ma'am, and then he spoke to Dean ma'am. He asked her about me, about my well-being, and he had asked Dean ma'am that she should tell me that I should take care of myself, and he had left a message with that note. And one thing that really got goosebumps to me was like, lately I was talking to one of my friends. She's studying in Jammu, and she was in Jammu. There's no snap of connectivity either of mobile or internet. So in Jammu but in Kashmir there is. So she also couldn't talk to her parents. So what she said to me was like, I can't take it anymore. Like I can't go without talking to my parents for so long, because I don't know like whether if they are alive or not, and I'm here waiting for their call. So it was very disturbing. Like I have never had such haunting thoughts ever before in my life. So this is how the restrictions on communication has influenced the people, or influenced those students who are out from their homes out here in many parts of India. So yeah.
Thank you, Muskan. I can't even begin to imagine how stressful this situation can be. Muskan is your classmate, but this is a situation around all over the country today. Surely, there must be a constitutional mechanism which allows for a clampdown of communications when it's national security. Can you just explain to us, what provisions are involved? When could you have a communications shutdown like this? And before Malavika, volunteers her views, can I just have a show of hands? How many of you think, just on the face of it, without knowing the law, that this isn't right? How many of you feel that this, the communication shutdown is right? How many of you feel that, this just isn't right? Show of hands, how many of you think it's right to have a communication shutdown? Complete communication shutdown in Kashmir. How many of you think it's wrong to have a communications shutdown? Okay, so despite the human element, there's clearly a split opinion, and possibly for security or political reasons. Can you actually explain to us the legality of the shutdown? Clearly, I think it's legal, maybe. So,
this is not a constitutional question, for the reason that the Constitution of India does not recognize a right to communication or a right to internet or anything of that variety. But that is an oversimplification, for the reason that Article 19 of the Constitution embodies all the freedoms enjoyed by the people of India, and therefore also the people of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Article 19(1) foundationally is the right of freedom of expression. It's the freedom of expression, which has been interpreted variously over the last 70 years by the Supreme Court to include the right to vote, the right to democratic participation, the right to publish newspapers, the right to circulate your newspapers, the right to wear and dress in whatever fashion, the right to self-expression and identity. So several kinds of rights have been brought into the ambit of the freedom of speech and expression. And the freedom of press is foundationally across the world considered, therefore, to be within Article 19(1)(a). But that said, the restrictions on communication can be imposed under several other laws. I do believe some of them lie in the Telegraph Act, but I'm unsure of the exact provisions. But the special situation that Jammu and Kashmir is in is that communication was always within the power of the state. While we like to believe that the state of Jammu and Kashmir had a special status and therefore had greater autonomy than the rest of the states of India, foreign affairs, defense, and communication were always with the Union of India, which is the case for every other state as well. And likewise, while we like to believe that all of these other rights were elevatedly accorded to the state of Jammu and Kashmir, because I've already mentioned that the constitution has been applied over the last 70 years in 40 odd orders. Most of Indian provisions also already apply as a result. What do I mean by that? The Indian Parliament has powers to make laws under the Union List. And the Union List has been applied to the state of Jammu and Kashmir in a constitution application order in the 50s, with modifications, of course. So some, I think the exclusions are, they don't concern communication at all. There is a residuary power that the union holds over tax, and two other things, I forget what they are immediately, but apart from then, the union holds all powers in the Union List over the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So there's no real way in which the state of Jammu and Kashmir can maneuver out on this theoretical claim to special status. The only real powers the state of Jammu and Kashmir has is those powers under the state list that have never been enacted on by the union through a union law, and those powers in the concurrent list. Now, the concurrent list is a list of powers that both the union and the state can exercise. So those powers in the concurrent list that the union has yet to enact a law on, the state of Jammu and Kashmir may make laws in. So essentially, they are bound by laws that apply to India. So if the Telegraph Act says that the Indian government can cut down even satellite communication, then that's just it. That's the way in which the law will apply to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. But there's I think, a deeper constitutional argument to be made. This is an argument, it's not self-evidently in law. And that argument is this: it's incorrect to think of federalism as the relation between the government of India and states as territorial units. By which I mean, they're not states as land, they're not states as territorially contiguous masses, they're states as people. Federal theory across constitutional theorists will tell you that federal relations is a negotiated compromise between the state and the people of a unit, not the land in the unit. And the entire Kashmir conversation in the media has become Kashmir Hamara Hai, which is the land is now ours, the territory is now ours, but federalism was never meant to be about annexing territory. It was meant to be about managing a relationship in balance with the people of a unit. So there are ethnically different groups of people in every pocket of this country. There are linguistically different groups of people in every pocket of this country, geopolitically and ethnically, particularly in the Northeast. And those special relations with the people have been recorded into several different kinds of federal relationships. And all of these federal relationships means we have federalisms rather than a federalism. So in one plain textual way, I think many will argue that it's fair to have a communication lockdown. But I think in a deeper, purposive way, as you said, which is to think of the purpose behind making a constitution, in that kind of deeper way, it's incorrect to think of this as we have the power to do this thing over a territorial unit. It is, do we have the power to do this thing to a people? And the people's cost, therefore, cannot be eliminated from the conversation because the law allows a brute majoritarian application of law over a territory. That's...
Thank you very much, Malavika. I think we all learned a lot from that question. So, is it illegal? Perhaps not, because I think defense, communication, and foreign affairs were always in the purview of the central government. But is it? Do you have a relationship with the territory or with the people? And that's the political question, right? So and I think that's a human question. It's a political question, and the debate for that is for another time and date.